see if I can get this right. Glenlivet, it has castles there. Drummond, Blarfindi, and Desky. And also one distillery, more famous than the castles 3. This is a quote from a piece of verse listed in a book that's one of my favorite books on Scottish whiskey. It's by Sir Robert Bruce Lockhart, and it's called Scotch Whiskey. And it's got a smaller subtitle, but you can buy it in paperback, but you're going to have to buy it used. But it's a great book on Scotch. We give it to the students at Whiskey Level 3 when we're diving into the world of Scotch. And it is a crazy in-depth overview of the history of Scottish whiskey. Crazy in depth and really, really fun to read. In the book, he talks a lot about how Glenlivet is the origin of the finest malt in the Highlands. And when he's writing about it, he's sort of talking about Glenlivet as an area, because Glenlivet wasn't always just a distillery. Glenlivet is, and still isn't, Glenlivet is an area. Think of it like Hayes County, Texas, or Dripping Springs. It's a region, basically the glen around the river. And at one point there were hundreds of distilleries in that area. And Glenlivet was only one of them. So how did that come? But Glenlivet was a stronghold of smugglers. Now, if you remember, in 1784, the English instituted the Wash Act, which would effectively, by 1785, created the line that divided the lowlands from the highlands in Scotland. And it shifted and moved a couple of times, but still fairly direct line from two different Clydes. And they taxed the lowlanders on whiskey production, and they taxed the Highlanders on still capacity. Now, it might take you a second to think about that, but when you tax on production, there's one reason you do it is because you're close enough to the people who are making things that you can actually see what they've made, right? So they only pay taxes on what they make. But up in the Highlands, where people are harder to get to and may or may not be hiding things, it's really hard to make sure that you're there to track every single thing that they've made. And so their shortcut was, we'll just go see how big your still is, and we're going to tax your still. Well, they taxed the still effectively at the rate that would have been taxed for a commercial still that was running, all year round. Well, most of the stills in the Highlands didn't run all year round. They ran around harvests. And so all of a sudden you have all these independent small operators who are basically taxed out of existence. So they just stopped making whiskey. They, spoiler alert, did not stop making whiskey. They just went underground. And that's the origins of the term moonshiner, right? Making whiskey by the light of the moon. And they are now, I don't know if you've never traveled to Scotland, but the Highlands are no joke. Even now in a modern vehicle and roads, getting around them is not simple. And there's often one roads in to areas and single road in out, or as recently as mid-1900s, if the roads weren't passable, they used horses to take things because of weather or snow or things. So, and then you've got the English and the gaugers, which are the tacksmen, trying to track them. Well, these are people who grew up in these hills. They know every nook and cranny and curve and river. And really, you think you're going to be able to beat them at their own game of hiding in their own highlands? That's just not going to happen. And what that kicks off is this really, terrible in a lot of ways, but also leading to a lot of amazing stories, era of the Highlanders smuggling whiskey. And often they were friends, like the taxmen who were supposed to be catching them and taxing them or capturing illegal whiskey, and the guys making it were friends. And there was this, back and forth bands and sneaking whiskey through in pretend funeral processions and filling whiskey barrels with fish instead of whiskey, and then pretending to smuggle them across Loch Ness and getting busted by the authorities. Meanwhile, the real whiskey's headed off a whole different direction. And go read some of that history. The stories are absolutely incredible. That whole season, Glenlivet and the whole region around, that's in the Speyside region of Scotland, was a hotbed for whiskey and made really great whiskey. And one of the people making whiskey was George Smith, who was an architect and a Latin scholar, who took over his father's farm and became a leader in the smuggler movement. And that's the origins of this whiskey that we're going to talk about right now, which is the Glenlivet. And you're going to see what we mean by the Glenlivet here in a second. I got my hands on this bottle. It is not cheap anymore. It was a little bit less when I bought it, but now because of all the prices of things, everywhere I look, it's running for like 170 bucks. Whew, that's high. But this is first and second fill bourbon cask. And what they mean by first fill, remember, is they get it. It used to have bourbon, it's empty, they fill it with scotch, that's considered a first fill. It's a reuse of a barrel. Second fill is they dumped it, then they filled it again, right? And then they mix this with sherry casks, ex-sherry cask, which they would maybe call first or second fill sherry cask. And it's 18 years old, which just means the youngest barrel they used in this whole blend was 18 years old. Often there's older barrels as well. I think, wow, that smells really good. I am one of the people who think that often the big brands like Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, Balvenie everyone loves, but some of these bigger brands sometimes get a little bit of a, like, whatever, it's just Glenlivet, big, but like there's a reason that they're still king. You can get initially famous because of tricks and marketing, but you can't stay there without good whiskey. And this is all fruit and peaches and pear, honeydew melon, a little bit of an earthy, musty berry note, like berries and cream. Not quite strawberry, but maybe a hint of plum. And it's a little bit musty in the way that good malt is musty, but it's almost entirely fruity. Very pretty nose. Oh, okay. See, it is a little bit soft. That proof is low, and so it drinks like it, 40%. But it launches with all of that fruit in the palate, and then sort of softens into a little bit of phenolic, peppery, earthy note. That's not near as heavy, earthy as a smoky Scotch, but it's just a little bit zesty and a little bit like fall decaying leaf kind of earth or overturned dirt. Soft, very simple, sugary, sweetness, nice. Now, no sugar added, as the W-set nerds among you will know. You can't say sugary if it's not sugar added, but there is a soft sort of honey, clingy sweetness to the end of this tail. So, oh, by the way, one little funny story about those stills, and we're going to get back to George Smith. At one point, the English started offering £5 if you turned in an illegal still. And so what the Scots did was wait until the copper on their worm tub wore out. And then they would go turn it in and report it as an illegal still. And then they would collect the $5 reward and go buy new copper and replace it so that their still was functioning again. So obviously it worked, this whole taxing and reporting thing. Anyway, so fast forward, because this went on for 100 or 50 years. It went on for way before that too, because there were 1661 tax was also in. There was a long history of all like people going underground making whiskey, and also it prevented them from selling the Highlanders from selling their whiskey in the lowlands, which was one of the ways they used to trade, right? So these Highland whiskey guys used to take their whiskey down, and instead of buying things, they would trade whiskey and whiskey barrels for things. Well, when you can't sell your whiskey in the lowlands, that's now what? There goes Edinburgh, and there goes Glasgow. What are you going to do now? They're not carrying a lot of cash. So 1823, the Duke, or technically 24, Duke of Gordon gets a law passed that makes it legal for Highlanders to distill with a reasonably priced license, right? And pretty quickly, George Smith, he was the first to go, okay, hang on. Writing's on the wall. I can either stick to my screw the English and let's just keep smuggling. I don't care what you say it costs. I'm not going to pay it. Or I can acknowledge that this is actually kind of a reasonable fee and other people are going to jump on this bandwagon, get it legal, and they're going to get ahead of me selling whiskey and turning it into a legitimate business. So he got in first. He was the first legally licensed distillery in Glenlivet in 1824. And immediately, all of his Highland brethren labeled him a traitor. How dare you? And all of a sudden, all of his men who were armed and used to help him smuggle his whiskey down through the highlands out to the lowlands, are now protecting him from his fellow Highlanders who feel like he's betrayed the cause. And it's such a big deal that he ends up having to travel armed. He ends up carrying a pair of pistols that were given to him by the Laird of Aberlour. And he travels with bodyguards and armed servants. In his early days, his still only produced 50 gallons a week. Now, that is basically the size of Crowded Barrel if they were working at max capacity, right? That's effectively a barrel a week, depending on how you proof it when you put it in the barrel, right? By 1839, only 15 years later or less, 15 years later, he was up to 200 gallons a week. Right? So 4 barrels a week. And then it grew from there. There's a really funny story, and funny is maybe the wrong word, but there's a really wild story about how one time he stops at an inn after coming back from market. He has a gold pouch on his waist packed with gold hidden under his clothes, and he sits down in the inn, and into the room walk and sit down 3 dudes who absolutely look like they have ill intentions and plan to make sure that he does not leave the room with that gold. And so instead of arguing with them or discussing it, he simply pulled out one of his pistols and shot into the fireplace in the middle of the room. Now imagine a closed, tight pub and a fireplace and an old, flint rock revolver, poof, right? In the middle, just bam, and he sets it on a table and he grabs the other one and pulls it out. And they all decide that they have more important things to do somewhere else. This dude was no joke. He was a tough guy. He died in 1871, but by then he had established Glenlivet as the cornerstone distillery in all of that area. And actually, it was his son, John Gordon Smith, and these names get really confusing after a while because there's so many mixes of Smith and George and John, and yeah, it's just all over the place. They end up with a whole bunch of distilleries in the area trying to call themselves Glenlivet. And it's his son, John Gordon Smith, that goes, no. There's only one Glenlivet. And then the people who are arguing with them are saying, no, but Glenlivet is a regional name like Dripping Sprees or Hayes County. And what the judge decides is that only this distillery gets to call themselves the Glenlivet. And all the rest of them have to use Glenlivet with a hyphen, Craigellachie-Glenlivet. And you can still see that on bottles as recently, I think it's like 70s and 80s. You can still find bottles of single malt scotch that say, the first name of the distillery followed by Glenlivet. And these days that doesn't happen. These days they all just go by Craigellachie or, whichever one. So these guys are the Glenlivet. And I just think that's a really cool part of history that we're still getting to drink whiskey from the early 1800s and the early days of smuggling whiskey through the Scottish Highlands, and that's pretty damn cool. So, also, while all of the men were off fighting all the smugglers or smuggling things and fighting with the gaugers and the English, guess who ran the stills and made the whiskey? The women. But that's a different story. In the meantime, I'm really glad you're here. Cheers.